Hello. My name in the Society for Creative Anachronism is Lady Agnes von Heidelberg, and I am going to try to teach you the basics of natural dyes. My compatriots and I at the dye tent at Lily's War in Calontir have created what we call a Natural Dyes 101 class that we teach multiple times, usually throughout the war. And I kept saying that I was going to finally create a video for this, and I keep putting it off, but now here we are. If you aren't familiar with the SCA, I'll make sure that there's a link to that in the description or the first comment. And any other links that I think you might need, look there as well. So we'll get started. I will be referencing our class handout that we laminated a long time ago, so that way it would be nice and pristine every time we had to teach at a war known for having thunderstorms. So here we go. The first is just kind of an intro into the concept. We get natural dyes from a variety of sources. There are, plants are probably the most commonly known, source, but fungus, mollusks, and insects all provide sources of natural dyes within an SCA context. The dyes that we have available to us now aren't always the dyes that were available within the SCA period. In some cases, we, make decisions and allowances not to use certain dyes because the period source isn't available to us, or because it's actually toxic. So sometimes we make decisions not to use certain things. One of the really important things when you're working with natural dyes is to make sure that you're not going to put the dye source at risk by using it. It's fairly well known within the natural dye community that some of the sources for that fancy royal purple that goes back to Greek and Roman times, that mollusk was almost completely wiped out. And only recently has it been started being using again on a small scale to recreate that ancient purple, because we're lucky it still exists at all. The same can be said for several of the insects that have provided red dyes traditionally. So you want to make sure that you aren't putting the source at risk by using it. I have once tried to use Kermes. It was very expensive. I was not very successful. I may try again, but it will only be for a small scale project because it is still a rather endangered species. Well, it's probably not endangered anymore, but it's still at risk. Another reason that, additionally, just because a dye is available in one time or place within the SCA period doesn't mean that it is appropriate for the entirety of all the SCA period and all of the countries that the members of the SCA portray. I think a really good example of this is logwood. Logwood's actually a New World dye. It was not discovered until they got over into South America. But once they discovered it, it was really quickly adopted in Europe. So it's great for late 16th century, Central European projects. Other than that, it's not really appropriate. However, I have actually used it in a 16th century Japanese dye project. The reasoning there was I had done some comparisons of the logwood and the Murasaki, that is the Japanese purple. The color comparisons were really close, and I could get the amount of logwood I needed for dyeing the project for about $50. To get that shade of purple on that scale for that project, I actually would have had to have spent over $1,000 to get the amount of Murasaki I would have needed. So it definitely is, cost prohibitive for me to have used the truly period source. But I had done small scale comparisons, so that way I at least knew, yes, the colors I was getting were accurate. So then the last bit on our intro is discussing that your materials need to be cleaned. Even if it comes from a prepared to dye source, there's a risk of some sort of residue being on the fiber, and any residue on the fiber, whether it's chemical or it's natural, has the chance of making it so your project will not be even, or that it will not just take up dye correctly. So there's the way that you clean your fibers depends on which fibers they are. You'll find that if you ever visit us at the Dye Tent at Lily's, we really focus heavily on silk and wool. That's not to say that we don't know a little bit about dyeing cotton and linen, or that it wasn't done in period, but the projects that we choose to work on are for eras and countries where silk and wool are pretty much the choices that make sense. So we mostly work with those protein fibers. Wool, you have to be careful how you clean it, because obviously if you're familiar with wool at all, it will have a tendency to felt up as you agitate it. So you have to be careful about that. I usually in the past have always just washed my, if it's fabric, I wash my wool fabric with Woolite, and then I tumble dry or line dry it. Make sure that if you're doing fabric for dyeing, that you do not put a dryer sheet in, or do not put any fabric softener in. That will add residue to your fabric. For yarn, you can get your cleaner, which recently I have had a chance to experiment with Orvis paste. I have only played with it once, so I'm not very experienced with it yet. We'll see how that goes. That is specifically for the wool, and with that you would put your cleansers, whichever you would use. Some people also use Dawn dish detergent because it is so gentle. You put that in your water, get your yarn in there, and then start heating up the vat. And don't really agitate it for wool, because of course you don't want to felt it. For silk, you can use textile detergent like Synthrapol, and that you can agitate if you want to. Obviously you don't want to get your stuff too tangled up, but that's certainly a way you can go about it. So for silk, I use the textile detergents for the most part right now. I took a class recently, so I am working on some new methods that I don't have written down yet, so we may update this class a little later. But that's where we're going to go. I'm going to go ahead and stop for right now, and we'll get on to the next lessons a little bit later. So, the next section of our class is a discussion of the types of natural dyes. There are 3 different types of dyeing methods. There's direct dyeing, vat dyeing, and mordant dyeing. Direct dyeing is the easiest form. These are basically dyes where you heat it in water, dip your fiber in with no other preparation other than cleaning it, and then there you go. So examples of this kind of dye that we often use at the dye tent are turmeric, onion skins, and gardenia. These are the easiest to work with, and definitely what I recommend for beginners, especially if you don't have dedicated dye pots. These are usually food safe dyes. But the problem is that they are not necessarily very light or wash fast, because there's nothing being done to chemically bond the color to the fiber other than using heat. So they tend to fade fairly quickly. That doesn't mean that they aren't used. Turmeric is supposed to be used quite often in certain Buddhist monk robes, and when it fades, they just re-dye it for something that is fairly simple, not heavily constructed garment. That is one solid color that is very easy to do. So definitely a fun way to start exploring the world of dyes without having to worry too much about the specialized equipment. Mordant dyeing is the most common form of natural dyes. Most dyes don't adhere to the fiber without additional assistance. So that additional assistance is your mordant. Mordants create a bond at the molecular level that allow the dye to adhere to the fiber. Most dyes that need mordants are very light and wash fast, but you know, that does vary from dye to dye. Some, you know, some of them are very fugitive, but they were still used in periods, so we still play with them. Depending on your fiber and the dye, different mordants might be used to achieve, you know, better light and wash fastness, or even different color effects. I'll get a little bit more into that when we get into the mordant section, which is next. Then the last type of dye is a vat dye, which, you know, it sounds kind of weird because we use a dye vat regardless, but this is the way that they are named. A vat dye is more of a complex chemical reaction. This is definitely where you get a lot more into the modern science. The most common type of vat dye you will see, and really the only one that you will likely find us working with at the Lily's Dye Tent, will be indigo. The complexity of a vat dye, you know, can vary. There's a lot of ways that you can make indigo work. Indigo is insoluble in water, and it has to undergo several chemical processes to make it so it will actually adhere to the fiber. We won't be talking specifically about indigo in this class, and other, I won't be talking about other vat dyes either, but the Murex purple, which is the mollusk that was almost destroyed to get that old world purple, that also must go through a similar vat process like the indigo. I'll probably get, a class on that eventually, but we don't have a handout already written for that, so I'll have to actually write that. One thing to remember when you're working with dyes is you need to pre-soak your fibers after they've been cleaned, but before you dye them. If you don't pre-soak them, then you won't get even coverage. So that's the section on the different types of natural dyes. Part 3 of our introduction to natural dyes. We're going to talk about mordants now. Mordants are really what we get the most questions about, even though sometimes people don't even know that they're asking about mordants yet. So this is really the most important thing to understand when you're talking about natural dyes. So there's a number of mordants that are found within the SCA period. Alum is the primary one that you're going to want to be familiar with. But there's also tannin, iron, and copper. My class handout here still lists tin. I recently found out, since I wrote this handout, that tin really is post-period for the SCA. It is also sort of toxic, so we really just never wanted to use it, and now that we've found out that it's not period for the SCA, we will be leaving it out of our discussions entirely. Copper and iron can also be considered somewhat toxic as well. On a large industrial scale, certainly they create a lot of dangerous waste that would not be appropriate. But on the small scale that we use in our classes and our small experiments that we do either at the Lily's Dye Tent or here at my house, we really are not talking about truly toxic levels beyond what happens if a penny, gets left out and begins to leach copper into the environment. So it's okay, but definitely you want to be considerate of what you're putting into the environment. The use of mordants on fabric, it creates a molecular bond between the fiber and the dye. So it's going to actually get your dye to stick to your fabric more readily. Mordants can also be used to change the end result color. Identical fibers mordanted in different mordants but dyed in the same fat for the same length of time will generally come out different shades or even different colors entirely. I think my favorite example of that is cochineal. It tends to be pink in its natural alum state. Sometimes you can get something close to red, but it still tends to be in the pink family. However, if we add copper to that, then we get lavender usually. Another good one that we recently discovered was lac, which is generally my go-to if I need a good, what we modernly think of as, nice scarlet red, not period scarlet, mind you, I will go with lac. But if I add iron, I get a nice royal purple, which here in Callantyre is a really appreciated color. So I think we will be seeing a lot more lac with iron these days at the Lily's dye tent. Another thing about mordants is different fibers require different mordants for best results. We'll talk about that in the next section on different fibers, but I do want to mention it here. Alum is generally considered by most natural dyers, that's your base, that's your standard mordant. You start there. Generally, alum is seen as giving you the truest colors that you can get with a natural dye. Alum can come from several different sources. The most common source of alum is mined alum, and this includes the pickling alum that you can buy at the grocery store. Mined alum would have been the source of alum through most of the SCA period. That's where the alum would have come from. But there are some societies that had access to bioaccumulator sources of alum. These are plants that absorb the alum naturally from the environment and accumulate it in the body of the plant. And then the plant can be used as a source for alum for dyeing. My actual favorite alum is a bioaccumulator, and it's called Simplicose, and it is native to many Asian countries. I actually started using it as a stand-in for a bioaccumulator that I had read about from Japan, but I have recently found out that Simplicose is also native in Japan, so it actually could have possibly been used there. I really like Simplicose. I like using the bioaccumulators because it's a renewable resource. The source of Simplicose that I have, they actually pick up the leaves after they've fallen, so it really is a clean and renewable source for my alum versus something that needs to be mined out of the ground. Tannin is the next mordant on our list. To my knowledge, plant sources are the only source for tannin. Now, you can get tannin in wines, you can get tannin in tea. There's a lot of places that tannin comes from. Tea is the most common one that you're familiar with. There are actually 3 different kinds of tannin, and if we are doing experiments in the dye tent, we usually do try to, when we're running our experiments, have examples of all 3 to show how they're affecting our colors differently. So those 3 different types of tannins are clear, yellow, and brown. Clear tannins don't really impart any color to the fiber when they're added. I personally don't like to use these because there is no color indicator for me to know that it is even on my fabric. But there are times when it is the appropriate thing to use, and so we still use it in our experiments. Then there are yellow tannins. Yellow tannins don't really give what I think of as yellow. They tend more towards tan and khaki colors. And you can use those on their own just for those shades. But they can also be used as modifiers. Then finally we have the brown tannins. Those also don't give what I think of as brown, really. You know, when I think of brown, I'm thinking of, you know, tree bark or the wood of my chair here, it's in the brown spectrum, but they aren't really brown. So those are our tannins. I really want to do a more extensive video about tannins because it really is interesting, the different things they do and the different tannins available to us. Finally, in our mordants, we have iron and copper. It really is incredibly rare to see these used on their own in an SCA context. If you approach other natural dyers who aren't restricting themselves to an SCA context, there are many things that you can do with these as mordants on their own. But within an SCA context, usually these are viewed as modifiers, either pre-mordanting them in addition to your alum, or adding it to your dye baths, or even as a post-mordant after you've dyed. Iron is usually seen as making colors kind of sadder, duller, and copper kind of brightens them up and makes them a little bit more cheerful, I guess. Both of these are known to sometimes give you a completely different end result. Like I mentioned, with the cochineal, adding the copper, you get lavender. One thing to be careful of, if you mix an iron with a tannin, it's gonna go gray to black. Now that the use of iron and tannins is how they got black in most of the SCA period. So it's a great thing to do. But if you get even a little bit of contamination one way or the other, it's all just going to go in that gray-black spectrum no matter what else you have going on. So you want to be really careful about that combination, unless that's what you're going for. You never want to touch wet iron mordanted fiber and then touch a tannin, or the other way around. Even that little bit is going to get that chemical reaction to occur. So when we are working with, if we're working with multiple different modifiers, you will notice us being very careful to keep the tannins on one end and the iron on the other. And often one of us will work with the tannin while another will work with the iron, so that way we can be sure to keep the two different mordants from mixing, so we don't end up with gray or black unless that's what we're going for. So that is the end of the discussion on mordants. Section 4. Now we're going to talk about different fabrics and fibers and natural dyes. So depending on your fiber, there is a big difference. You have your protein fibers, which are your wool and your silk. And then you have your cellulose fibers, which is cotton, linen, hemp, any other plant-based fiber that you have. Generally speaking, if you're using direct dyes, there's not a whole lot you can do to make up the difference between the fibers. I think direct dyes are really great for the cellulose fibers personally, but they also work great on the others. Vat dyes, sometimes you have to be careful on your different fibers depending on the chemical nature of the vat. I once dissolved some wool yarn that I had in an indigo vat that was too potent. So that's a thing to consider there. Really, the big place where you find a difference between your fibers is when you're talking about your mordants and your mordant vats. Protein fibers, so your silk and your wool, They work great with alum just as is. We focus heavily on them at the Lily's Dye Tent because most of the finds of period materials that have been dyed are wool and silk. That's not to say that it's true for the entire SCA period. It's just, and that's only discussing what's been found in different archaeological contexts. Certainly there are some cultures that used cotton. India is the one that comes to mind. Cellulose fibers don't really work so well with just the alum mordant process. So the general rule of thumb in modern natural dye circles, there's kind of two different takes that I have read. One is that you do an alum mordant bath, then you do a tannin bath, and then you do alum again. I have also heard the tannin alum method. My experience is with the first one, with the alum and the tannin and then the alum. But I don't play with it a lot, so my experience with those is a lot less. When we have used that method, it's worked pretty well at giving us some nice, good colors that don't immediately just wash out on our linen or our cotton. But the colors are never as pretty, in my opinion, on my cotton as they are on my silks. But I, again, haven't played as much, so maybe I just need more experience. That is really all I have for this section. This next section of our class is touching on the difference between yarn dyeing and whole cloth dyeing. We don't have a large section of that in this class. I do have a video that I made for a friend that is out there now that does teach the basics of how log dyeing works. So just putting that out there. So there are those who will tell you that you can use a vat to dye cloth exactly the same way as you would yarn. I don't really agree with this unless you either have a very large vat or aren't dyeing much cloth. Getting that even coverage is so hard, and I have some pretty big vats and still do not just put my fabric for a new gown in the vat and just stir. I would never get even coverage that way. You'd have to have some of the really ridiculously large vats they had in period to really get good even coverage that we like to see in our fabrics these days. So at the Lily's Dye Tent, we use what is called the log. This is a method that I learned from Mistress Willow from Answer Fiora. I am not going to try to pronounce her full SCA name because I'm pretty sure it's Scottish and I'm pretty sure I will mangle it. She really did a lot of extensive research in developing this log method. She has taught it down at Gulf Wars several times. That's where I learned it. According to the research she's done, she really doubts that that whole cloth dyeing was done in Europe before the 11th century. So that's kind of the approach we take at the Dye Tent as well. One note is, generally speaking, if you are planning on attending a dye class, in an SCA context. Unless it's stated otherwise, just assume that the only dyeing that will be happening will be either yarn or raw fiber, such as unspun wool. It's very unlikely, unless it's expressly explained, that classes will have the setup for teaching whole cloth dyeing. So just never expect that. So that's our discussion on yarn versus whole cloth. So here we go. Now we're getting towards the end here, and now we're gonna talk about VAT courtesy. This is a big one. Sometimes people don't realize that they might be being rude. So I wanted to make this list of courtesy topics so that way you wouldn't accidentally make assumptions you shouldn't. So the first thing to assume when you're attending a class is just never ever assume that you're going to get to do what you want. Know that you're going to need to do work within the context of whoever is teaching the class or the workshop. Always check any information provided ahead of time. You know, the class description or, you know, any instructions that may be provided. You may need to be prepared for certain things. And if you aren't, you may not get to participate at the level you would like to. If you bring your own supplies, always talk to the teacher or the leader of the workshop before using any of your own supplies. Depending on the class, your project may not fit. If I'm running the Lily's Dye Tent, I may not be able to working on a project that you bring during a class time. But if you talk to me, then we might be able to set up a private time. But that's Lily's, where we usually have a lot of waiting for things to happen occurring, and so we can make those adjustments. If it's a shorter time scale event, there just may not be time to get something that you want into the vat. You may bring your own yarn, but I may not have enough dye stuff for your yarn, even though you aren't using my class supplies otherwise. So always make sure you talk to the teacher before using any of your own project. Never overdye without permission. If you are overdyeing, you might accidentally contaminate the dye vat, and if they still needed that vat for something else, you could be ruining other projects that were already planned. So always make sure that it's okay before you add a secondary color to your project. If you have used a mordant other than alum on your own project and you are bringing it to class, double check that it's okay with the vat that you're using. This specifically, goes back to our understanding of the tannin iron combination. If you were to accidentally introduce iron to a tannin vat, we could end up with gray, and that would be very disappointing if that wasn't what was planned. Be prepared to somehow identify your project from others. A lot of times the teacher will have a method planned. But if you have your own method for identifying your own projects, bring it in case the teacher doesn't have anything planned. The teacher or leader of the workshop should be the only person who doesn't have to identify their own pieces as they come out of the die vat. The most common usage I have seen is a combination of modern acrylic yarns, usually 2 different colors in different combinations for each student. So that way you tie those on to the project, and then when they come out, it's modern acrylic dye, the dyes didn't stick, and and you can see, okay, red, black, that's, that's me. Purple and gold, oh, that's you. So be prepared. Always assume that if you don't pick up your project before the end of the event, that the teacher will keep it and not return it. They might be nice, but don't assume it. Setting up and taking down these dye workshops is a lot of work. There's a lot of work involved, and most of the time, if you haven't picked up your stuff, I don't have any brain cells left for keeping track of who has what. Dyeing is an expensive hobby. Be aware of how much you are asking to dye. Most dyes require a minimum of 15% of the weight of fiber in dye to achieve desirable results. Consider monetary or work-in-kind compensation if you are trying to work on a large project. I usually have a donation jar out because I'm uncomfortable specifically asking for money, but I really appreciate it when people offset the burden. I put on the Lily's dye tent because I greatly enjoy sharing this hobby. I don't expect all of the money I spend on dyes to show off to all of my friends to be reimbursed. But one of my compatriots at the dye tent, a long time ago, we realized she helps me so much that she pretty much always would offset any money that she would use for the dye stuff in her work. So that often not having to lug water to the dye tent at Lily's War is huge. So if you want to come play with us and you can't afford the dyes yourself, ask us what you can do to help, because it's hard work and there's a lot of it. And we're always happy when we don't have to do it. But not everybody will be like that. So be prepared for paying for the dyes that you're using. If you're wanting to do a small project, or you're just participating in class, a couple dollars in the donation jar, you're probably good. Never assume that a dyer will dye stuff for you just because they're your friend and they're already dyeing. Generally, if you're not willing to put in the work, or you have a very good reason for not being there at the time, I will not just dye something for you. Just because I have the dye pot set up. Especially if it's cloth, because the cloth is a lot of work. So I've had people do that before, that thought, oh, I'll just give you this, you're already dyeing, you can do it, right? No. Work in kind is often more appreciated than money when you need something dyed. If you're willing to haul water, tend fires, or hold up whole cloth off the ground so that way the rest of us can actually work it into the vat, that will go a long way towards winning the goodwill of the people running the dye tents and the dye areas. So that's just some dye etiquette. And we have one more video after this, and then we will have covered the Dyes 101. Okay, so finally for this portion of our video, I finally have some help over on the video camera. we are going to talk about how to prepare your yarn for your dye class. If you're wanting to play with us, doing this ahead of time can save you a lot of trouble. Now, if you're like me and you know you're going to want to dye a lot, you might want to buy a whole cone of yarn, but then you're going to have to skein it yourself. To skein yarn, you're going to need this little tool. It's called a Niddy-Noddy. I don't know why, but that's what it's called. They break down nicely. I've made them with pieces of PVC pipe before, but of course this is much prettier. So you put them together so they're like this. The top and bottom are at right angle to each other. You're going to hold it in the middle. I think I need to get this one so it's a little bit tighter. It's a little loose up there right now. I'm going to hold on to my yarn, and I'm going to take it over. I always make sure that I'm starting with these little lips here at the start of my winding. It helps kind of hold on to it. So I come around and I come back, and because I'm going slow, I have to be careful about my tension. And then eventually I come back out to where I started. You don't have to zoom in, hon. Not yet. So this part is the boring part. And yes, this shouldn't be twisting that much, so I'm going to need to put some stuff to tighten that up. And so I will usually keep careful track of how many times I go around. This particular Niddy-Noddy gives me about a yard. So then I know how many yards, so each time around is a yard. Then I know approximately how many yards of yarn I have before I dye. That, of course, the amount after dyeing could change due to shrinkage, due to the heat of the dye vat. This particular time, since I'm talking and teaching, I am not keeping too close track of how many times I'm going around. I have used this Niddy-Noddy enough times that I can usually have a pretty good feel for when I have what I think of as a full skein. If sometimes I'm lazy and I just order skeins of yarn, and that's a little bit easier to work with, we still will want to go through the next step that I'm going to do after I have finished winding up a skein here. Because not all yarn comes tied off like you need it for dyeing. Some of the places that I order my yarns from, they tie it off correctly, but they don't necessarily tie it off as many times as I would like, so I sometimes still need to add some tie-offs to my yarn. This is going to be a slightly small skein, but I think I'm going to go ahead and stop here. So, not yet, hon. I'm going to cut off my tails a little bit long, and I tie it off while it's still on the Niddy-Noddy. And then I just tie a quick little knot in there. And then the nice thing about this type of Niddy-Noddy is I can just slide it off right there. And now it's come off. So now I have cut, and this is where we start to zoom in, my love. So I have cut these lengths from my cotton crochet thread. I chose these specifically because I knew they would stand out visually compared to the rest of the yarn for this video. I do like to use something that is not going to be the same color as the end dye result, just because sometimes I really want to see what my project's doing, and if I have a very large piece of yarn, sometimes finding these little ties in there can be difficult. So I would not want to use red if I were going to dye red. though it doesn't make as much of a difference for this. So when we're setting up our yarn, we want to make sure that we don't accidentally just tie it off really tight like this. That will actually make it so that the dye can't properly penetrate the yarn, and you'll end up with an uneven dye job on your yarn. So we want to make sure that it's tied nice and loose because we don't want it to all just come apart in the dye vat. So the way that we do this is we take, and depending on the size of your skein, it may change how many times you want to tie it off. At a minimum, you want to tie it off 3 times. And so we're going to split our yarn into 3 different sections. Doesn't really matter, they don't have to be even in size, they just need to be different. It's 3 separate sections. And then we're going to take our string and we're going to weave it. So we're going to go under, and then over, and then under. Now, we're going to take the other end and we're going to go the opposite way. So we're going to go over on this one, under there, and then over on the top. And then we're just going to tie it off, again, leaving it loose, so that way we are making sure that we're not cutting off the dye from the fiber by making it too tight. So there we go. This is really loose. I definitely could have taken it up some more. For this size of a skein, this is really tiny. This is a really big loop, but we're going for visual on video, so there we're going to go. Now we're going to move over to another section of the yarn. So here's this up here, and we're going to do the same thing. But the one thing you want to keep in mind is you don't want to keep the exact same set of strings in the exact same chunks of separation. If you were to keep it all together like that, you would actually not be tying it off securely at all, and it would still come apart. So I tend to just, go through and kind of grab some differently sized groupings, and then again, we're going to weave it through. I really have to slow myself down on this because I have done this for so long that it just is really automatic for me. And then we're going to pull this one and go the opposite direction. And then tie it off. Now, sometimes I end up with really long threads after I've tied it. So I'll probably would snip this off here because these are really long and that can end up getting tangled, especially if I have multiple skeins in the vat. So that leaves room for tangling, so I'll probably trim those off so that way they're shorter. And so then you want to do that at least 3 times. Unless my skeins are really short, I tend to usually do 4 times. And I will sometimes, I'm not going to show it, but I will usually actually use these strings left over from when I put the skein together, and I will use those to also tie off the skein, but that would be really hard to show you on the video, so we'll go ahead. I'm going to do these last 2 really quick to just kind of show you how I do it when I'm doing it normally, and in the interest of saving some of your time, because you don't want to spend all day here watching me skein yarn. You would, in theory, want to do any washing of your yarn after you have skeined it and tied it off. If you don't, then if you wash it before you get it ready, then you're just asking for a mess. And if you don't wash it after you work on it, depending on, you know, how sweaty your hands were, if there was anything on the machines when they were making the yarn, how sweaty the person packaging the yarn was, you know, all sorts of things, then, you know, you are potentially still going to have an uneven dye job on your yarn. So there we go, skeined yarn. And now you have the knowledge you need to prepare yourself for a dye class at the Lily's Dye Tent. Hope to see you soon.